If all the bees disappeared off the surface of the globe, then man would have only 4 years left to live. No more bees, no more pollination, no more plants, no more mammals, no more man. Albert Einstein. Most of you don't think about insects that often, and when you do, it's usually in the negative light. But what if I told you that the world you live in, and the civilization and culture you are a part of, and the very natural world that you thrive on, is dependent on mere bees? In one of my previous videos, I covered the relationship between humans and mosquitoes, one between our most pernicious predator, which has caused untold suffering and death upon our species. But that is not the sum totality of our relationship with insects, as there are other insects buzzing and pollinating our crops that we thrive on. The bee. This humble, winged insect with 3 body components, 6 legs, and an infinite work drive has transformed the natural and civilized world alike. Found pretty much everywhere except for Antarctica or space, bees live wherever there are flowering plants. Wherever the flowers go, the bees follow, feeding off of pollination, which is pretty much plant splooge, and nectar, which is pretty much liquid sugar. These little bugs live every human kid's dream, a diet based off of sugary goodness, and they won't get diabetic afterwards. This forms a symbiotic relationship in which the bees get food from pollen and nectar. Nectar for the adults, pollen mostly for feeding the larvae, and in return, the flowering plants get free transportation for their progeny to spread further and further abroad. One helps with food, and the other one helps with proto-sex. Never was a finer pairing. But that symbiotic relationship is not just relegated to those partners, but nearly all organisms around them. All the animals that rely on flowering plants for food and shelter, or indirectly to the animals which they eat, rely on these flowering plants, and are in turn in debt to bees. As humans make up most of those categories, or are part of multiple of those categories, as we eat plants that they pollinate, along with the various animals that eat those plants that they pollinate, higher and higher up the food chain. There are countless species of trees and bushes that not only provide us with oxygen, but also fruit, oftentimes reliant on pollination. And while bees are not the only pollinators, they by and far are the most numerous and most hardworking. There are countless species of bees, not all of which produce honey, and some can't all sting you, some are even solitary. However, I'm going to focus on the honeybee, and to a lesser extent the bumblebee. Bumblebees are these pretty derpy looking bees known for their fluffiness, and they do play an important role in pollinating, a role that has unfortunately declined due to pesticides and habitat loss. For this reason, I'm really going to focus more on the honeybee, and while other types of bees like the carpenter bee also are really interesting, I'm just going to focus on honeybees just because they are the most important as far as humans are concerned. Many of these bee societies are, after all, communist societies. While the communist societies of the 20th century proved to be failures, these bee communist societies have proven to be a success. In a honeybee society, resources, work, childcare, maintenance, food production, and nearly everything else are done communally. However, this is not some sort of utopia, in which there is freedom and fairness without hierarchies. Like many of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, bee societies have very, very rigid hierarchical structures. Most members have rules and resources, but no rights or freedoms. Only a life of hard labor under the queen bee. The queen is the only female who reproduces, alongside with a relatively small number of reproducing males. The queen acts as a totalitarian communist matriarch, ruling over her society of mostly females, who do all the guarding, planning, gathering, honey production, and offspring care for her. Kind of like a deadbeat dad who has 17 baby mamas and 20 kids, but doesn't really do any work to provide any of the child support, but gets everyone else to provide for them. And I guess you could also look at this society in the same sort of way. It's kind of like a communist feminist utopia. Anyway, moving on from politics, the rest of bees are, as stated before, usually female, mostly working on the many castes that perform different tasks, such as that of the soldier, gatherer, nurturer, honey producer, and wax builder, etc. The parallels between the Indian caste system and communist societies are rather interesting, however there are gaps here and there. Despite their social structure not being conducive towards freedom, it does ecologically work brilliantly. making bees widespread throughout much of the world, save for oceans and polar regions. Granted, with human pressures such as habitat loss, pesticide use, and invasive pathogens, their wide ranges are shrinking. While not a single species, honeybees and a vast array of types oftentimes will share one trait. Surprise, surprise, they make honey. We all know honey, a sweet liquid with a viscosity that is made from refining nectar. They do this by regurgitating the nectar using enzymes in their digestive tract. So when you eat honey, you're kind of like basically eating bee puke. The honey is stockpiled in the hive, which is made from wax, the structure of which is found in the honeycomb, made from hexagonal shaped wax compartments. Anyone who has played the game Civilization or the board game Settlers of Catan knows how effective hexagons are for maximizing the utility of space and the function of structure. Humans, seeing this sticky goodness after all, and all of its high caloric content, had probably tried to attain it from wild bees, but got stung in the process. Bees will lose their stingers in the process of stinging you and die. Kind of like a self-deletion bomb, except with honey instead of jihad. This combination of threat and reward led to the craft of beekeeping, a form of agriculture practiced since the days of the pharaohs of Egypt. Granted, I'm assuming those giant beekeeper suits didn't exist at the time, and the stings were probably a lot more common. Whether or not you count honeybees as a domesticated animal is debatable. They are one of the few, aside from dogs, that were nonetheless quasi-sort of domesticated both in the Old World and the New World, as beekeeping existed not only in ancient Egypt but spread across much of the Middle East, Europe, and elsewhere, but also existed in some form in Mesoamerica before the Spaniards had arrived. Granted, even though we farmed them for honey, I don't think you could count an animal willing to kill itself to sting you as domesticated. Let's just say farmed-ish. Whether you consider them to be domesticated or not, they have inspired various human cultures. The Kalahari people, known as the San people or Bushmen, who are the closest genetically living people to our early human ancestors, tell a story of a bee that carried the prey mantis across a stream. The exhausted bee ended up just kind of dropping the mantis on a floating flower, but ended up planting a seed. As the mantis body ended by, dying, the seed sprouted up, creating the first human. Fossil records do not support this theory of a human sprouting out from a dead mantis or a floating flower dropped by a bee, unfortunately. But it does tend to cover a lot of the themes in mythology of life stemming from death. The Greeks eventually had a god of beekeeping. If people in the West today were polytheistic, they would probably have a god for craft beer and another one for dog walking. Bees were also associated with the Oracle of Delphi. Bees had also been featured in art, from rock paintings to poetry to mediocre movies starring Jerry Seinfeld as a voice actor. However, their depictions in fiction are not quite as important as those in real life. The list of crops pollinated by bees is huge, including ones you probably wouldn't think of as being pollinated by bees, such as grapes, almonds, allspice, cotton, limes, coffee, beets, plums, and clovers. However, much of this is coming into jeopardy as various wild bee colonies are collapsing due to a variety of factors such as pesticide use, climate change, bacterial or fungal infections. Habitat loss is probably the most important of all. Even if you don't care about bees, you probably should. This may have massive food insecurity repercussions on our human populations, with an ever-growing population, particularly in the developing world. We owe it to bees, and almost all species on the planet, to ensure that bee populations are protected through the use of mitigating climate change, protecting habitats, reducing pesticides that harm bees, and most controversially, perhaps maybe even using technology to breed and produce more resilient subspecies of bees. After all, in the long run, we need them a lot more than they need us. Our civilization rests on the back of these buzzing bees.